Welcome everyone, thank you for sticking out all of this day, overcoming all of the different obstacles from the rain to the changed rooms, everything that made it really difficult for us to get together to have this final lecture, but managed to overcome them, so thank you very much. My name's Kojo, and I'm going to be talking to you all for the next 45, 50 or so minutes about the way amnesia functions in terms of Britain's colonial history and its relationship to the current configurations around race, identity, place and space that we have to deal with today. And so I want to say, first of all, thanks to everyone from Consenta for putting this all together. I feel very honored to be closing out the show. This is kind of like my headlining Glastonbury moment for academics. So I'm feeling like Beyonce in 2015 for real. But it won't be as exciting as that though, but hopefully we'll do something that can relate to some of the other talks and be found a little bit interesting. So, why are we thinking about colonial amnesia in this conference where we're supposed to be investigating the kind of configurations of race specifically in the UK? The reason why is because race is intrinsically bound with the project of empire. Race is a child of empire as opposed to being the other way, something that was created through the political and economic project of empire. And when we're thinking about how that then works in Britain, I think we really have to recognize that it's of specific importance to British history, because Britain, as well as being the most successful of all of the European imperial nations and the big kind of 17th, 18th century game of globalized armed robbery, Britain is also a configuration that's really produced through the empire itself. And that's something that I don't think we appreciate when we think about Britain as a nation state, as a distinct nation state. We often describe Britain as having had an empire, but it'd be in fact more accurate to describe the empire as having had Britain. And what I mean by that is the idea that Great Britain as a nation state never really existed as an independent totality until the imperial project kind of cohered it together. In the 17th century colonization of Ireland, the 1707 Act of Union, we really see the emergence of Britain as a particular distinct entity through Scottish elites being attracted by the potential riches of the colonial project in order to finally submit to the jurisdictional power of Westminster. And so through the imperial project, you get the unification of this so-called island nation, and that unification is something that was really sustained by the wealth and the power that was gained throughout the imperial project. I think it's really helpful to think about this historian David Egerton, who's written this brilliant book called The Rise and Fall of the British Nation State, where he describes the United Kingdom as being in an important ideological sense, not only the owner of an empire, but actually having been part of an empire, something that's been brought together through that imperial project. And yet, for something that's so significant as part of this country's constitution and its own history, details of empire are actually surprisingly absent. Surprisingly quiet on actually what was the empire, where was the empire, who was in the empire, when did it happen. These aren't part of the kind of national story of this country. Instead, and particularly in the kind of recent Brexit moment, we get this image of Britain in the past as being a racially homogenous island nation that kind of accrued its wealth through its own innovation and its own technocratic developments, when for reality is, for most of its history, Britain has been a multiracial, multi-faith, global spanning empire. And I think that's really important to appreciate if we want to understand why walking around London looks like it does nowadays, or why this room that we're sitting in looks like it does nowadays, that this is the history of Britain. Furthermore, I'd say that this popular amnesia as well also simultaneously romanticizes Britain's past of control, but actually stays particularly quiet on how that control was both gained and how that was lost, keeping it as a kind of unprocessed national wound that this country still struggles with. So that's the kind of basic theoretical position that I'm offering out, but it's always worthwhile, as us academics can be full of gassing ourselves sometimes, it's always worthwhile to test this out, to test whether what I'm saying, that Britain is actually pretty distinct in its silence on its imperial project, and how that affects the kind of general amnesia we have about British Empire to this day. So I'm going to do a little fun game that I like to do when I do my international law classes. This is actually something that I think might not work as well because we've got such a savvy, intelligent, consented crowd here that know a little bit more. But when I'm usually teaching my international law classes of, out in Essex with a lot of young students, the responses can be pretty spectacular. So we're going to play a little game called Pom 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 Pom. Did Britain colonize or not? Did Britain colonize or not? All we're going to do is it's going to be 5 pairs of countries. One of them, Britain colonized. The other one, Britain didn't. And we're going to find out whether we know where was part of this political and jurisdictional constitution called the British Empire. And so the first pair that we have to choose between are Oman and Kuwait. Oman and Kuwait. One of them Britain colonized, the other one Britain didn't. I'm gonna give everyone a chance to act collectively. Okay, everyone's talking in there. Okay, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna offer a chance for everyone to raise their hand. Okay, so first one. Hold on. Everyone who thinks it's Oman, could you raise your hand? It was, so Britain did colonize Oman. Oman was part of the British Empire, so everyone thinks Oman. Everyone who thinks it was Kuwait, lift your hands up. Cool. For everyone who put the hand up for Kuwait, you are correct. Congratulations. I know a lot of you waited until everyone else had put their hands up before you jumped on it, but it was indeed Kuwait. Kuwait was part of the British Empire from 1898 to 1962. Oman was actually colonized by the Portuguese. So we're going to go through these quite quickly. The next one, from my African brothers and sisters, Lesotho or Gabon. Which one of these was in the British Empire? Could I get a hand up for Lesotho? For Lesotho, anybody? No one? Okay. For Gabon? Hands up for Gabon. Cool, there's a couple of boys in the back there for Gabon. It was Lesotho. The first one was right. There we go. Lesotho, part of British Empire from 1868 to 1966. Next one we have coming up is Malaysia or the Philippines. Malaysia or the Philippines. Which one of these was in the British Empire? Could I get hands up for Malaysia? Nice. Could I get hands up for the Philippines? Cool, there's a few brave people who went for the Philippines. Incorrect, it was Malaysia, unfortunately. Malaysia was part of the British Empire, and Philippines was part of first the Spanish, and then the under American protectorate control. 2 more to go. Next one, Panama or Botswana. Panama or Botswana. Could I get hands up for Panama? I see a couple hands up for Panama, nice. Could I get some for Botswana? The majority was correct. It was indeed Botswana until 1964. And finally, we're going to go for Belize or Grenada. Belize or Grenada. Which one of these was part of the British Empire? A quick check, okay? Could I go for Belize? Hands up for Belize. Yeah? Hands up for Grenada. Grenada, yeah? That one was a trick question. I was wrong on you. Both of them were part of the British Empire, indeed. Grenada, 1763 to 1974. Belize, 1862 until 1981. So 1981, almost within our lifetime, a bit more my lifetime than some of the younger people in here. But hopefully, that exercise gives us a little bit of an indication in how even as intelligent and savvy a crowd as we have here at the Consented Summer School, there is still a large amount that we don't know about where the British Empire extended to, and which has been erased in kind of Britain's national mythology, Britain's national history of what it is. And so this absence of knowledge, this amnesia, I think is something that's quite crucial in terms of thinking about how race and identity are going to function in Britain in the 21st century. Because in a lot of these places, there isn't the same level of amnesia as there is particularly here in the United Kingdom. So that is what Britain looked like in 1920, less than 100 years ago. And the thing I think which is important to remember is the famous map colored in red doesn't really show the actual scale and significance of the British Empire, because it wasn't so much an empire of territory, but in terms of both wealth and population. And so in terms of wealth and population, you're talking about almost a quarter of the world's population, huge amounts of people under British colonial rule and contributing to the wealth and privilege of the imperial metropolitan centre that we have here in the UK. And so I think that this is something that is really not, it's just not fully appreciated in terms of, this is something I found out, I just came back from Ghana, digging through some of the family archives, and I found this old picture, which is actually of my granddad in one of Britain's colonial schools. And so those kind of schools, those kind of institutions are spread out through all those different places that we just saw on that red map. A lot of these particular areas that Britain now sees itself as perhaps potentially returning to form trade links in the post-Brexit moment have the memory of British imperial rule. And before my granddad passed, he used to tell me a few stories about how the kind of disciplinary rule was within this particular institution, and it was not pleasant. And so the memories that exist, I think, beyond our borders are something that would be quite different to what is kind of accepted here. And this is really, I think, the significant story of Britain in the 20th century. This is what happens to that political configuration known as empire. Huge process of decolonization. We can see how the majority of places that receive decolonization exist in the latter half of the 20th century. Some of them, like I said, a lot of them in definitely within our parents' lifetime. Some of them places like Brunei in 1984, incredibly recently. But how many people you speak to might even have an understanding that Brunei was ever part of the British Empire? How quickly that erasure has occurred. And so this reconfiguration of what Britain is and what kind of imagined community, as Bennett Sanderson would describe, a nation state, what kind of imagined community Britain is something that has been an unprocessed national wound, I would say, within the kind of collective psychology of the United Kingdom. And a couple academics and intellectuals started to try and think through that. And so if Britain was an empire rather than a nation, and if it had what would be quite a traumatic fall of empire in the middle of the 20th century, what would be the kind of psychological consequences on a national scale of such a moment? A couple answers that have been provided. A former colleague of mine, Nadine El-Nani, who's a fantastic law professor at Birkbeck College, has written about how the loss of the empire has trapped Britain in a moment of kind of imperial nostalgia. And she saw that as connected to the Brexit vote, to the way in which there's a constant harking back to a glorious British past, carry on, these kind of tropes and ideals of what Britain used to be, when it used to be great, when it used to have control, all of these kind of ideas, leaves Britain in this particular moment as trapped in a nostalgia for a long-lost glorious past. Paul Gilroy had a slightly different kind of psychological reading of this particular moment, where he described Britain as being trapped in a melancholia, a potential kind of a never-ending mourning for this loss of imperial rule. This melancholic mood, he says, kind of colours in the ability for Britain to kind of refuse to face up to its loss of status, its loss of power in terms of the global order. And so whilst I definitely have a lot of affinity and drawn a lot of influence from both of those ideas, I've thought about potentially a different type of psychological state that I think really determines Britain's imperial history, and that's a certain quite unique level of amnesia. And so whilst I think that there definitely is a nostalgia for the period of British rule, there definitely is a melancholia about the loss of British rule, the loss of control, I wonder if that nostalgia and that melancholia is specifically about the details of empire. How much do they know about the empire? If the empire is being erased, then what is it we're feeling nostalgic and melancholic about? And I think that this is required in order for us to appreciate then how Britain actually saw itself at the time of its imperial rule. Did it see itself as an empire? Did it see itself as an empire in the same way that potentially more nationalistic, more militaristic European rivals saw themselves? You know, it's not uncommon for there to be a certain erasure of the kind of violence of imperial rule. It's not surprising that there's been an erasure of, torture in Cyprus or in Kenya. It's not a surprise there's been an erasure of massacres, whether in Ireland or in India, from the British imperial history. But what kind of first drew me onto this question and brought me to this kind of conceptual idea of amnesia was recognizing how in Britain there's a unique amnesia even about the scale and so-called kind of moments of triumph of British Empire. My original PhD project was looking at international drug law treaties on an imperial level and thinking about the British role in terms of the Opium War. You think that this would be part of national mythology. Little Britain defeats the previously unconquerable Qing dynasty of China, seizing control of Hong Kong and establishing trade routes through the Far East, but yet nobody knows anything about it. Completely erased from British history. As is victory in the Crimean War, as is the unification of Nigeria. That was one of the things I had a debate with a colleague of mine recently a couple of years ago when there was terrorist attacks, one in France, one in Nigeria at the same time. And we're bringing in the conversation around, how can people mourn so much the loss of life that occurs in France, but erase and ignore the loss of life that occurs in Nigeria? And my colleague responded that, well, you need to understand, Britain has a much closer historical and cultural link to France than it does with somewhere like Nigeria. I was just like, Britain invented Nigeria, literally defined the boundaries, gave it its name, gave it its legal system, gave it its political system, gave it its education system, gave it its national language, and now all of a sudden it's like, I'm not familiar, who are you? This level of erasure is something that's quite distinct. And it's something that actually, when you start digging back through the histories of how the British Empire always kind of conceptualized itself, it's something that was there from the very present. So this idea of being absent-minded imperialists. This is a quote by an English writer, John Robert Seeley, in a fantastic 1883 book called The Expansion of England, where he says, "We seem, as it were, to have conquered and peopled half the world in a fit of absence of mind." Like, didn't notice, sorry guys, we appear to have taken over and have all of your stuff. This is, I think, quite different from the kind of imperial nationalism that you see in terms of Spanish imperialism or you see in terms of Belgian imperialism. There's not an equivalent figure of a Cortés or a Pizarro in terms of British imperial history. There's not an equivalent figure of a kind of a Napoleon conquering type figure. This idea of British imperial dominance is very silent. Who are the people who did it? How did it relate to the actual expansion and progression of the state itself? A couple of other quotes as well, which I think are really helpful to try and see how Britain kind of conceptualized this. Jan Smuts, who was a British imperialist in South Africa, who was actually one of the architects of the apartheid system in South Africa, contrasted the British Empire against the other European empires, describing them as being violent colonial projects and describing the British Empire as being, I quote, "an embryo of the League of Nations based on true principles of national freedom and political decentralization." And at the peak of World War II, King George also described how Britain manages to kind of exempt itself and distance itself from empire by stating that imperialism, this is a word that our enemies use against us. By that they mean the spirit of domination and the lust of conquest. We are free peoples of the empire, all of us, and we cast our word back into their teeth. It is they who think of it as having evil aspirations. And so again, this idea of empire being a rather benevolent and primarily economic endeavor as opposed to one of military conquest and military domination. So how does that happen? How do you have the world's largest empire in history whilst at the same time kind of conceptualizing yourself as not being an empire. For me, it starts to anchor upon the materialist basis for how the British Empire was propagated, as opposed to largely being produced and being cultivated by national armies, famous conquerors, famous generals. A lot of the British Empire was achieved through what you might call the outsourcing of empire, through financiers, privateers, chartered companies, industrialists, all these capitalist entrepreneurs who were able to, through state sponsorship and through state encouragement, cultivate British control over distant parts of the globe. Cecil Rhodes, your East India Company. Individuals who might not be particularly famous in terms of British national story, but who had a huge impact in establishing British control across the world. And so these quasi-state actors really manipulated the kind of, and this is of specific relevance to me as a law professor, specifically manipulated contractual forms and property deeds in order to try and establish British control over far reaches of the globe, whilst erasing the violence of what was actually occurring. The idea of the legal form is that there's an equivalent between the two parties. It's merely a meeting of minds, an agreement between two individuals. When you have a property deed that's been established, when you have a contractual form that's been completed, the actual extraction and the violent expulsion of indigenous people from their lands gets buried within that particular form and gets externalized from the national story into the story of entrepreneurial capitalism. And this is something the British Empire did to a greater extent than its European rivals. It really exploited innovations in commercial exchange and property rights in order to ensure that the empire presented itself as an instance of kind of technocratic management rather than one of glorious conquest. And this helped produce, as I say, a self-delusion, even amongst some of the elites of empire, people like the Jan Smuts, people like King George, that the British Empire is essentially a benevolent endeavor, and the British hegemony around the world is really the kind of default norm. It's not something that's sustained and enforced through violence and brutality. And so instead of really understanding itself as an empire and as something that has had an imperial footprint across the world, I think what's really distinctive about the United Kingdom, and this is something that the cheerleaders of Brexit understood quite well, is that it actually has in its own self-mythology an anti-imperial national history. And that sounds completely absurd and contradictory, but I'd like us to think back to the quiz where we struggled, some of us struggled less than others, but struggled to detail the kind of outer reaches of the British Empire, and then think about how familiar we might be with some of these figures. People like Winston Churchill, people like Sir Francis Drake, people like Lord Nelson, who's on a massive tower in Trafalgar Square, you know what I mean, who's named in a BBC poll in 2002 as the greatest Briton of all time. These figures are mythologized in such a way that they are seen as being the protectors of the United Kingdom against an external imperial threat, whether it's seen as Nelson defeating Napoleon at the time of in the Battle of Trafalgar, where it's thinking about Churchill and the Nazi threat, this whole idea around Britain stood alone. You know, no one tells the Russians, who lost, you know, more people in the Second World War than everyone else put together, or Sir Francis Drake and the Spanish Armada. These are the people you're taught about in your GCSE history class. These are the figures who are seen as our national heroes. And in doing so, what I think that we really get is an establishment of this idea of Britain as being a small, independent, underdog island nation that is standing up against big imperial bullies from elsewhere. And this is the narrative that the Brexiteers really drew on, really manipulated in order to try and resonate with the populace at large. It's a narrative that was really kind of constructed, at least in my reading, following the Second World War. So the Second World War and this idea of an island nation standing alone is something that is not even taken, as you saw from the quote from King George in 1940, not taken at the time of the Second World War, but really kind of retrospectively constructed afterwards. So the idea of the Second World War being a largely domestic story, think about the images we have of the Second World War, whether it's the Battle of Britain, whether it's, the Blitz, rationing, railway children, Dad's Army, all of this kind of stuff. This is taken to try and establish an almost seamless link between Britain as an island nation and what Britain could be if it was able to escape itself from the grip of either supranational economic forces like the European Union or infiltrating people of colour who have entered the country post-Second World War without legitimization, at least according to this particular narrative. There's a little memory of key victories that occurred across the empire. There's a little memory of the idea of the empire as itself contributing towards that particular conflict in terms of, from Libya to Lebanon to Ethiopia. Little recording of all the imperial soldiers who contributed to that particular conflict. Those are all erased in the national mythology. And you actually get, in that moment, a configuration of there being an almost seamless link, I would say, from the kind of warfare state to the welfare state that you get in post-war Britain. And this retrospective construction of Britain as an independent island nation, standing alone against the Axis threat, fuels a lot of the rhetoric and a lot of the hostility that the post-war migrant generation, which Natasha and Alex were talking about, face once they land on the UK soils. They are seen as gaining the benefits of a welfare state that they did not contribute towards. Britain really provides this narrative of the idea that the NHS, unemployment insurance, all of these benefits of the welfare state are the reward for the British people for having sacrificed so extensively in the Second World War, erasing the contributions that were made by people in the colonies and therefore establishing a structure in which indigenous British people see those individuals as infiltrating and as illegitimately claiming rights to resources that they haven't sacrificed for. And I think that this setup continues to rear its head in how Britain understands itself today and how it's kind of entering into the 21st century. It still has the idea that if it was able to establish its own borders, seize back control, be an island nation state again, it could return to a moment of glory, hegemony, dominance, decoupling the hegemony and dominance that it enjoyed in the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries from the brutal and violent imperial project of the British Empire. Through erasing the violence of the British Empire, there's actually an ability to try and recall that moment back into the popular imagination. Because empire, in the North configurations, in the British configuration specifically, but in any configuration, is really just organized armed robbery. That's all it is. It's just getting everyone together, going somewhere else, and extracting whatever you can from there. And so that is the element of the imperial project. But I think what is distinct about the British imperial project is the way that it's synthesized with emergent forms of capitalist externalization of violence, configured itself as a benevolent project, much more of a trading federation, or, to quote Jan Smuts, a league of nations unified in the well-being and profit of the country as a whole. and therefore is able to return to that moment through renewed trade links to the Commonwealth, renewed trade links to the rest of the world, which I guess they imagine are greedily waiting for Britain to come back and re-establish that form of benevolent relationship. So I think that this is something that we really want to think about when imagining how conversations around, like I say, race and identity are going to flow in this kind of post-Brexit moment. I think when you understand Britain's imperial amnesia and you understand the way that Britain configures itself as a kind of independent underdog nation against imperial control and imperial reach, you understand why someone like Boris Johnson can gain resonance when he says that following the Theresa May Chequers deal, that if that was accepted, that Britain is truly heading for the status of a colony, status of an EU colony that would be weakened and unable to assert its own sovereignty. You understand better why Trade Secretary Liam Fox talks about how we need to go back to being, and this is I quote, a small island nation perched on the edge of the European continent that became a leader in world trade. That's the particular history that is remembered there. You understand a little bit more why this idea of take back control, take back sovereignty is able to resonate at the same time as simultaneously looking to expel and kind of erase to expel not only people of colour, not only migrants, not only those who are the living legacy of the British Empire, but also erase any concept of that empire as having actually have functioned in the way that it did. Excellent. So, that's all I had to say, and I'll be willing to hear back on some responses. Cool. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think some of the amnesia would probably be due to the fact that people that were making the money were the ruling classes and the upper classes, and all of that kind of empire side of stuff was largely for the benefit of the people and the elites. And and it's very easy for the same people that are in control of the media to then manipulate that and kind of keep a lot of that, like you say, the violence and everything else that entailed out of the spotlight, and just kind of basically use their own private money-making schemes on other sides of the world where people don't really know about what's happening. The working class people that are working for those same people in these factories in the UK.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's something that's borne through in terms of the kind of historical research. So a couple of books which might be interesting for people who want to look at how that was kind of remembered at that moment is someone like Bernard Potter's The Absent-Minded Imperialists, which is a history book, which details how even things that we associate as being Britain celebrating its empire and being so proud of its empire are actually only institutions that were established as the empire was crumbling. So things like the red map, that is a kind of the famous image of the British Empire, it's something that only comes in following the turn of the 20th century. It's not something that's popular at the kind of Victorian moment. Same with Empire Day. Empire Day is brought into the actual, as with a lot of things like the study of English literature or stuff around British history, it's actually taught in the colonies before it's brought into the British mainland. Empire Day was celebrated in the colonies to try and get the colonial people to be happy about their subjugation and domination, but it's only brought into the British mainland in 1904. So in that particular 19th century moment, I think there is a real separation between what's known by those who are benefiting and who are running empire and those who are simply existing and are not really accruing the kind of benefits of empire in the same way. It's not as integrated with the kind of British national story as a moment like the Second World War is. The Second World War is something that everyone has to know from the time they leave primary school. The British Imperial project, even at its apex, wasn't the same.
What's the memory of empire in previous colonies? Maybe you could speak specifically about Ghana.
Definitely. So this is something, that I think has probably been latent to me, most of my life. So, I grew up. I was born in Ghana. Moved over to the UK when I was about 2 years old, but I go back every summer. So my mum would have enough of me every summer and be like, go to your grandparents, get away. And so we'd go back every summer and you'd come back and the complete amnesia about, so I also grew up in the north, which is also worthwhile explaining. Those from London might not be familiar with this, but in the north, no one knows where Ghana is. Like, I'm not talking about my friends, I'm talking about the teachers. The teachers would be like, where is that? It's like, miss, you teach geography. Like, this is embarrassing for all of us. But that level of amnesia was huge over here, but then when you go to Ghana, you see how the political system, the educational system, the religious organizations are saturated in the memory of British Empire and British imperial rule. And that operates, I think, on multiple levels. On one hand, in those countries, there is also a certain, I would say, a certain, not even nostalgia, but more a kind of a misremembering of what imperial rule was among certain classes. So I'd say that, British imperialism, another way that it managed to kind of externalize the violence of it was through more divide and conquer policies. The idea of establishing local control and local kind of subjects who were able to sustain that control was something that was really employed by the British Empire. And so within certain legacies of that, you do get a kind of romanticization and a feeling of proximity with Britishness, even more than a kind of indigenous culture. But you also, I think, have a national kind of hostility towards returning to that condition of colony again, which I think that especially the Brexiteers do not appreciate. So something that's a really practical example is that whilst most of the European nations can get entry into Ghana, Britain, you have to pay a visa. So you have to pay a visa to get into Ghana, due to an attempt to try and establish that, no, we're not simply going to be another client state, we're going to try and establish our own independence and autonomy. And so that's something that I wonder is really appreciated by your Boris Johnsons and your Liam Foxes, you know what I mean, and your Dominic Raabs, who assume that in the rest of the world there is this dream to return back to the 19th century global order, with Britain as the kind of educational and economic hegemon, and everyone else happy to participate in that. That wasn't what it was like in the 19th century, and that definitely isn't what it's going to be like in the 21st century. So we've got a couple more. Should we take more at a time, or?
Yeah, I see one.
One at a time, yeah? All right, cool. Go ahead.
Have you done work in secondary schools? Even if you haven't, how would you go about teaching this in secondary school students?
Have I done any? Yeah, so before I did my PhD, I used to work in Peru, which was pretty fun, yeah. I used to work in something called the Complete Works. I don't know if anyone's familiar with it. But I guess I was quite limited by the curriculum, so I didn't really talk too much about this, although I guess these conversations would kind of bubble up when we did like a lot of English literature, so, we did some Charles Dickens, we did some, what else do we teach? I can't remember now. Macbeth and stuff like that. But yeah, thinking about the way, British literature was used in the colonies prior to being brought into the UK. If I had to return to do that nowadays, I think, yeah, doing stuff like just, I guess, exposing how bizarre it is that less than 50, 60 years ago, all of these countries were part of the British Empire, and now we have no idea where they are, what happens in them, what are their legacies and what are their memories of former British rule. So I think bringing that might be something that's quite interesting for students, and it might also, give them a different imagination of what the global order is. So, yeah, but I wouldn't be an expert on that. One last one. You just wanted to jump in, did you? Go ahead.
Just to jump in. I'm a first generation immigrant from Zambia, and I just remember growing up sitting in classrooms where it wasn't possible to engage with why I was there. It's like the questions that I was getting from other children about why I had come here. I could never engage with how I was part of this history of the British Empire. And I wonder the kinds of secondary school games you could do is remembering who's in the room, what are the places that people are from in the room, from India, from Pakistan, from Zambia, from Ghana, and then being was this a previous British Empire, and making those links in those ways, and also just allowing the kids who are not from here to be able to like arrive in that room and to have a journey being told about why we find ourselves here.
Yeah. And I think, even when I find ourselves here, I'd fully agree. But also, the thing that I try and kind of emphasize, particularly taken from Stuart Hall and his whole idea about I've always been here, that we've always been here, we've always, it's like I'm the sugar in your tea, and you know what I mean? I am, or like the wealth and the power of Britain has been a result of always having been in a political and jurisdictional relationship with people from the rest of the globe. So they've always been part of Britain. They're not people who have infiltrated following the Second World War. So I think that's quite an interesting kind of turn to make. I think that's the last question.
Just on the topic of schools, I remember like in primary school we used to the Tudors and the Egyptians again and again. Do you think this kind of stuff could go like further back and be studied in primary schools as opposed to secondary schools? And also, do you think it should be just like a curriculum that's given to kids, or do you think it should be like an interactive workshop style teaching?
Again, so I wouldn't, seem to be an expert, especially in terms of primary school. But I think it's definitely something that could be interactive and could be quite fun for kids to undertake. And the thing which is interesting is that the other history is being produced already. So my little nephew is at nursery, and he's already celebrating Armistice Day, and he's already been made to, do a minute of silence, and already been taught about the First World War and the Second World War. I'm like, man, you can't even count to 5. Like, leave the boy alone before you give him the national propaganda. So that history's already been brought in, and so I definitely think that it's something that could be relevant even in primary school. Come on. Okay. Should we go one last one? Go ahead.
I was going to ask how like the education of like the history of Britain has changed like from when you did it to like present day. With like our GCSEs, I think there's been a recent reform, and basically it kind of revolves around how Britain really isn't Britain without everybody who's like immigrated from different countries. So like the Vikings came and the French came and the idea of Britain is more. It initially started as a dichotomy question of like, what we are is not heathens, which is what they describe people who actually made them. Vikings came, they immigrated, French came, and like that literally shaped what Britain is today.
Yeah, I think that's a really crucial point. Yeah, I'm glad to hear that that's been taken up a little more in schools nowadays, that like even the so-called white indigenous British population is the result of emigration from all different places. I always think that when there was an attempt to present a kind of pure ideal Englishness, that's often presented as being an Anglo-Saxon. And I'm like, there's already a hyphen in that. So there's already a certain amount of, multiple identities and, interrelation within that very kind of core construct of Englishness. So definitely the presence of people from far beyond, I think, is an element. But I always think it's particularly interesting of Britain as a political configuration, which is slightly different to England. And these are the questions that we're going to start having to face over the next 20, 30 years. What is Britain? Because as I and other people have argued, if it is a configuration that was produced and sustained by empire, then it's not surprising that following the fall of empire, you're starting to see the fragmentation of that particular institution. So of course you have the loss of Ireland in 1923, you now have increasing devolution of Scotland, Wales, and we've got the potential of Scottish independence being on the cards over the next few decades, and definitely Northern Irish independence. This of what is Britain outside of the empire is a question that I think is actually being answered for the very first time now. Because you have Empire Britain, which is the sole history. You then have, following the fall of empire, a failure to kind of interrogate the trauma of decolonization. You have a mitigating of the loss of the wealth and loss of decolonization by the entry into the European Union and the European community. And now you have Britain trying to be its independent island nation state for the very first time. And what's that going to look like? And who's going to be part of that? I think it's an interesting conversation. Thank you. Brilliant. We're done. Thank you very much.